Greetings, conservatives. This is your humble host, John Moraga, and we are back with more ConservaCast. We look forward to keeping you informed with the latest and most relevant commentary of conservative issues. So without further ado, here are a few topics I'd like to discuss.
Well, I'm just going to jump right into it today, folks. On the docket for today's ConservaCast, I'll be addressing the Israeli elections, the potential impeachment of President Trump, and the Democrat presidential primary field. All of which, ironically, somehow tie together. So to start it off, I'll be addressing the Israeli elections. Now, this is a topic that I've been addressing in a number of the previous ConservaCasts. And for those of you who have been following, I promised that I would kind of explain a little bit more in detail the inside baseball of what's going on over there. Well, on September 17th, Israel officially held their election. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the process that goes on, it's extremely complex, which I've stated in the past. It's even more complex than the process of the United States. And so for that reason, I would encourage any of you who have visited our website to check out an article that was written on conservativescorner.com. The title of the article is, "Are Israel's Recent Election Results a Bellwether for the U.S. 2020 Showdown?" In that article, I kind of lay out a simplified version of how the Israeli elections work. And so if you want to kind of go over how that process works, that's a good starting point. I'll try and restate that here and now, but basically what takes place is that the Israeli electorate goes to the voting polls and they select or choose a party. They don't necessarily choose a candidate. They actually vote for a party and the party's platform, what they are promising, their platform of political ideologies, and what most aligns with the individual Israeli citizen. But the citizen does not directly vote for a candidate. And so what happens is the Knesset, which is the legislative body of Israel, has 120 quote-unquote seats. And so depending on how many people vote for a particular party will determine which party will have a majority in order to govern. Now, speaking of parties, the Israeli political system has numerous parties. Some have more influence than others. But they're not a two-party system that we're accustomed to here in the United States. Even though in the United States we do have other parties that take part in elections, such as the Independent Party, the Green Party, the Constitution Party. There are a number of other smaller, minor parties which every election hope to gain more influence, but typically the two major parties in the American system are the Democrat and Republican parties. Within those two parties, there are several factions that work together to progress or help influence the bigger parties. So getting back to Israel, in their system, they actually have more than two major parties. Now, the exact number does fluctuate. And that is because some parties lose support and fall out of favor, and some parties may join with other parties in order to have more influence once they are elected. And that's actually kind of the case of what's happened now. So recently, in this last election, the current sitting Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, his party, the Likud party, has not been successful in gaining a majority of the seats necessary. That would be 61 or more seats, which is more than half of the 120 seats currently in the Knesset. Or, alternatively, that would mean that they won the majority outright. But alternatively, they could form what is known as a coalition government, which means that if they have a support or they've won the support of the votes for less than the 61 seats, they could make some type of deal or coalition with some of the other minor parties in order to reach that 61 or more majority. So, for example, especially in this election, what happened was Netanyahu's party, Likud, won officially now, according to the latest results, 32 seats. That was less than his main rival, the Blue and White Party, which won 33 seats. Now, because they each won the bulk of the vote, but not enough to win an outright majority, both would be forced to have to form coalitions with other minor parties. Or actually, they could form a coalition with each other, which is very tenuous because they don't like each other. They're rivals politically. They may have some things in common, but the leader of the Blue and White Party, I believe his name is Benny Gantz, really disdains Netanyahu. They used to be colleagues, but I don't want to get into that history. The point is, the two major parties, Likud and Blue and White, need to or are required to build a coalition with some of the other minor parties in order to gain a majority. Now, here's where the inside baseball gets a little bit tricky. This was a major blow to Netanyahu. In fact, most media news outlets are essentially writing his obituary, his political obituary rather, because he was not able to gain the majority outright, which was pretty expected. But he also was unsuccessful in gaining the most votes of any other party, which he's essentially done his entire political career, which has been essentially a decade as Prime Minister of Israel, this past decade. So because he fell short, it was a really big news story. The fact that he has essentially now had to face the possibility that he may not be the prime minister. Now, there's even more that I can get into as far as the details and how the process works, but I'm trying to keep it at least a little bit somewhat able to be digested, if that's the right terminology. And because he fell short, he's had to face the reality that he may not be able to survive this election. And even further, because of what has also been going on, he's been under a cloud of controversy with some indictments, some legal issues, not unlike what we've seen in the United States with President Trump, obviously different legal issues themselves, but there's been even a heavier, darker cloud over Netanyahu's political future because he's been accused of a number of questionable legal engagements. So if he does not survive being able to remain as Israel's prime minister, he will have to then face some of the legal consequences that he's been able to avoid, because similar to our system where the current tradition is that you cannot indict a sitting president. In Israel, he's been able to avoid indictment as the prime minister for kind of similar reasons. But if he's not able to remain as prime minister, he will definitely have to face those. So what's going on as far as him being able to survive? Well, the rival party, the Blue and White Party, thought that they were able to form a coalition government that would then be able to oust Benjamin Netanyahu. So with the 33 seats, I believe, is what the Blue and White Party won. They were going to build a coalition government with other minor parties, and specifically, one of the parties had, I believe, 12 seats, which was the United Parties of Arab political parties. They were a coalition within a coalition, if you will. The 12 seats were comprised of different, even more minor factions. But in a turn of events, 3 of those seats vowed to not form a coalition with the Blue and White Party. And so, bear with me, trying to explain this and hash this all out. The Blue and White Party end up having less of a coalition majority, or a coalition bloc than the Likud Party. Because with the 32 seats that Likud won, they were able to form a coalition government that was able to form, I believe, 55 seats. So in other words, the Likud Party joined forces with other minor parties to gain 55 seats, whereas the Blue and White Party, who by itself had technically one more seat than the Likud Party, was able to get the coalition of other minor parties only to get 53 seats. I believe those are the correct numbers. And so, although by itself the Blue and White Party had more seats by one than the Likud Party, they had less seats as a coalition with other parties than the Likud had with other parties. That's already starting to get tangled into some things that most of you may not even care to know about. My point is just that what's going on right now is because there is such an uncertainty, bottom line, to sum it up, because there is such uncertainty, the president of Israel, which is for the most part kind of more of a ceremonial role, a little bit more involved than the Queen of England, who serves more of as a ceremonial position. The president of Israel has the power in these certain circumstances to wield a little bit of a political sway that may tip the balance one way or the other. So technically, the president of Israel is tasked with appointing the leader of one of the parties to form a coalition and officially obtain the governing position. And the leader of that party would then would then become the prime minister. So in the case of the Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu would remain as prime minister. In the case of the Blue and White, Benny Gantz would become prime minister. Now, because this has reached an impasse of ambiguity, the president of Israel, last name Rivlin, has tried to encourage the 2 major parties to build a coalition with each other. So take a moment and try and digest how this is all working and processing. So without the other minor parties, if the Likud and Blue and White Party both decided to put away their differences and join together as one party, then they would have well over the 61 plus seats needed to form a coalition government outright, without any of support of the other minor governments. That causes a lot of problems because of the way the system works over there. The major parties have already made promises, whether in writing or verbally, that they wouldn't join forces with each other as major parties, and that they would be willing to form a coalition government with their respective minor parties and join forces. So it's a tall order for the 2 big rival parties to try and put away their differences and come together in order to form a coalition government, or a unity government, rather. But nonetheless, that is the current state of what's happening in that election process. We're well after the election day itself. They've just now released the official results, which are still, unfortunately, there is still some question of irregularities in those votes. But as it stands, the president of Israel has asked the two major parties to try and come together. And even to make things even more complicated, what would happen is that they would serve in a rotating premiership. What does that mean? Well, kind of as it sounds, pretty straightforward. They would take turns, the leaders of the parties, of the respective parties, that is, they would take turns serving as prime minister. So Benjamin Netanyahu would serve for a certain time and then turn it over to Benny Gantz. And then Benny Gantz would serve for a certain time and then hand it back over to Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, there is only one previous historical precedent for this, and I'm not going to get into that. But the point is, this is what they are trying to hash out and work out as far as a possible resolution to this complex ambiguity that's happening right now in the Israeli election. Now, as most of you may already be questioning, well, who would first serve as prime minister? Which then makes things even muddier. Because if the two rival parties that are already being asked to put away their differences likely will be bickering over, well, who gets to serve first. This is only the ideal, or not ideal, but at this point, preferred outcome is that these two parties and leaders come together to try and work something out. But if they don't, if they cannot see eye to eye, and if they cannot work something out as to agreeing as to who would serve first, and their talks just crumble, I'll probably be back here, and maybe I'll even have a chart and a diagram and a flow chart and Venn diagrams of how all of this works. Because if they can't work this out, there is an increasing likelihood that Israel will be going to a third election within a 12-month period, which is really historically unprecedented. Because there is so much divisiveness, which is not unfamiliar to the states, the United States, that they cannot decide on how to move forward and how to effectively elect their leaders. I hope I've put some clarity and not more ambiguity on this topic. And for those of you who want a little bit more background, as I said, please go to conservativescorner.com, and check out the article that I mentioned. It is entitled, "Are Israel's Recent Election Results a Bellwether for the U.S. 2020 Showdown?" Which takes me to my next topic, which is the potential impeachment of President Trump. Now, I am the last person to claim to be a prophet. No, that is not me. That is not what I claim to be. That is not what, by any means. But I will say that by writing this article well before some of the recent news came out in the United States, I kind of hinted at what may be happening in the United States as a result of the Israel elections. Now, I was discussing the actual specific 2020 showdown, but the potential impeachment of President Trump is, for the most part, related to that. And what I said in the article, for those of you who haven't read it, is that there are a lot of similarities between President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu as far as the support for Israel's security and the legal entanglements that they have found themselves in, and that there could be a potential that if the left-wing media could find a scenario where Benjamin Netanyahu was no longer the prime minister of Israel, well, then they may smell blood. They may jump at the opportunity to say, well, the left-wing liberal activists and media were successful in taking out Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. So maybe there's a possibility that could happen with President Trump. Now, I also laid out in the article some of the differences that we have as far as how the process works with electing our government, and a number of other issues. So I did kind of balance and try to write objectively of the similarities and the differences. But no sooner was that article published, there is now a looming impeachment inquiry that Nancy Pelosi has put forward into the House of Representatives because of another situation where President Trump may or may not have subverted or done something illegal by talking to Ukrainian officials about digging up dirt on Democrat presidential candidate Joe Biden. I'm not going to get that far into the weeds of that situation itself. I mainly want to just focus on the fact that they're now using this latest scandal to try and now seize on the opportunity to try and officially go after Trump through impeachment processes. Unfortunately, it is really reminiscent of the article I wrote because it really does look like they smell blood. And with the Russia investigation and the Mueller report and what's happening now, it's pretty obvious that they are, the Democrats that is, are trying to do everything within their power to derail a Trump re-election in 2020. And this is the latest attempt of that. So I don't know that they see a correlation, but I just find it pretty ironic that once the Israeli elections happen and they see the potential demise of Benjamin Netanyahu, Nancy Pelosi has now officially gone forward more so than she has in the past. She's kind of seesawed between whether or not she would put forward impeachment hearings or inquiries or whether she would not. And so I assume, just reading the reports and looking at what's going on, that she smells blood or potentially has the insight to say this is our last chance, this is our last hope. Because to be honest, folks, the Democrat primary field is weak. It's embarrassing. I mean, I'll talk about that in just a moment when the last topic, which is why I said at the offset that all of these topics essentially tie together. But staying on the potential impeachment of President Trump, the idea that now the timing seems to be right, at least in the minds of the Democrats, to officially put forward impeachment inquiry. An impeachment inquiry in the House of Representatives. Because to be honest, because the Democrats have a majority in the House of Representatives, it's likely that they may actually succeed in pushing this forward. Now, I'm not sure. I don't believe the actual proposal that they're pushing is an actual impeachment. It's an impeachment inquiry. So I don't want to get into the weeds of that either. The point is they're moving forward more than they have in the past with trying to impeach President Trump and trying to derail his 2020 reelection. Now, they're hoping that they can gain steam by convincing enough senators, Republican senators to go along with them. Now, in the Senate, the Republicans have a majority. Small, but still a majority. And Mitch McConnell, being the head of the Senate or the leader of the Senate, majority leader, it doesn't look likely that they will succeed in the Senate, but they are trying to do as much as they can in the House of Representatives to move the ball forward in that. There's some murmurings that Mitt Romney may be considering backing this proposal or this push to impeach President Trump, and he may be successful in swaying a few other Republican senators. I don't think that's going to happen, personally. I honestly would be shocked if it did. Excuse me. But that is the goal at this moment, is to try and seize the opportunity of the most recent scandal or perceived scandal with President Trump to try and impeach him. Now, it actually, I think, is working against the Democrats. Why do I say that? It reminds me of those Acme cartoons with the Wile E. Coyote or Daffy Duck or any other cartoon. If you can imagine, for those of you who saw those as a kid, when they try and bite off something, and they bite off a rope that they're being tied to, and they keep gnawing. This kind of sounds like an old-fashioned typewriter. And they go so far, they wind up biting off the rope or chain or whatever it is that they have on themselves. But they go so far that they then start biting their own leg or their own arm or their own limb or whatever it is. And once they realize that they're actually biting themselves, well, then they might back off. Because they look at the camera and they look at you as the audience and they're like, uh-oh. Because they realize, as the saying goes, they bit off more than they could chew. That reminds me of what's happening with the Democrats. In their own echo chamber, I think that's a pretty accurate term to refer to it. In their own echo chamber, they've convinced themselves that this is a good move, that going after President Trump through impeachment processes is what the American people want, or at least they've convinced themselves of that so much that even if they recognize or stepped outside of the box to see that that isn't, at least for a majority of people, they would disregard that and still move forward. So, unfortunately, they're actually helping President Trump, in my opinion. They're actually being counterproductive to what they're actually trying to accomplish. And for those of you who might consider yourselves conservative, but are never Trumpers and don't like President Trump and think, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and you may be secretly rooting for Democrats to succeed in impeaching President Trump and taking him out. Or if you're a diehard liberal or Democrat who genuinely just wants President Trump out, whatever camp you fall in, unfortunately, just as an objective observer looking outside the box, I honestly think it's not going to be a successful attempt to take him out. Again, that's my opinion, and that's just from looking at what's going on and kind of reading the tea leaves, so to speak. And moving to the next topic that I was going to address, which kind of, again, pertains to this. One person who is against the impeachment proceedings is a Democrat who's running for president in the Democrat primary, Tulsi Gabbard, rather. She has come out in a number of interviews recently saying that she is against the impeachment processes or attempt of President Trump. Now, obviously, being a Democrat, she has a lot of differences with President Trump and is actually trying to replace him as president. So she is not somebody who, by any means, is a Trump supporter. On the contrary, she is a Trump hater, if I could use that term. It's probably a little bit harsh. I probably shouldn't say hater, but for somebody who's running in a political primary to try and replace him, she definitely does not see eye to eye with him. So for somebody who doesn't see eye to eye with him, it's surprising and intriguing that she is not in favor of impeaching President Trump. Now, kind of following inside baseball and politics, I've noticed that a number of quasi-Republican or conservative, mostly libertarian people have really been interested and intrigued with Tulsi Gabbard's campaign. Because she is an active member of the Army National Guard, and she's a veteran of the, I believe, Afghanistan or Iraq war, but she is a veteran serving in the military. She has some more street cred than some of the other candidates, and because she at least appears and gives the impression that she has a little bit more of a moderate feel to her and a reasonable approach to how she views her politics, she has been very interesting to people like Tucker Carlson of Fox News and several other people who may otherwise consider themselves Republican or conservative, even if they don't outright support her, even if they're fully aware of her Democrat liberal views and positions on certain issues. She has definitely gained the respect or at least attention of more so than the vast majority of the rest of the Democrat field. So, speaking of that, the idea that she could be appealing or potentially appealing to Republicans, moderate Republicans, or those who have more or less conservative leanings, but still register as Republicans and vote Republican. The idea that she would be appealing to them should be more of a threat to the Democrat Party. It should be something that they take notice of and maybe perhaps want to promote her. But during this entire campaign, she's essentially been dismissed by the DNC, by the kingmakers, by the power brokers. She's been essentially shunned because more than likely they don't want her to be as appealing. They may view her as a threat that should she actually gain traction and unlikely win the nomination, well, then all of their extreme liberal left-wing ideas and platforms will then go by the wayside. Ironically, I don't think that'd be the case. I think she'd probably jump on the bandwagon of them, but in their minds, they're so obsessed and they have gone so far extreme to the left that even the potential of a relatively, and I say relatively with extreme caution, relatively moderate Democrat is no longer welcomed in the Democrat Party. In fact, the second debate, I believe, that they held, she really clocked Kamala Harris in the debate. She really took her out as far as her campaign, and ever since then, Kamala Harris has not recovered. I spoke about that in the last ConservaCast. Kamala Harris's campaign is the most embarrassing of all campaigns, but I don't want to divert to that. The idea that Tulsi Gabbard was successful in essentially just exploding Kamala Harris's campaign, you would think would gain her more attention for being an effective orator or being an effective politician, having political prowess in doing so. But no, she has not gained airtime on the liberal networks. Nominally, she has, but for the most part, she's still sitting at 1%, 2%, 3% polling, whether it's in individual states or general election polling. She's still sitting at a pretty low polling, mainly because she's not getting any more attention. She's not getting interviews or TV time. Now, you could say that's a conspiracy theory or paranoia, but she more often finds herself on Fox News than CNN or MSNBC. At least that's been my observance of things. Because they, being the DNC or the Democrat Party, probably feel that she is a threat. Now, really quickly, getting back to Kamala Harris's campaign, because I think it's just entertaining. I think it is hilarious. I think it is just, I'm biased. I'm from California. She's the former Attorney General. She's a sitting U.S. Senator from California. Her entire career has been, I don't want to use certain adjectives that I'm thinking in my head. I don't want to speak that ill of a person, being a God-fearing person and knowing better than to speak ill. But just from a political commentary viewpoint and observance, I have found it completely entertaining of how so many people tried to prop her up and give her a false sense of being a rising star and the next Barack Obama in the presidential field, and to see her now dipping below Buttigieg in a lot of polls and a lot of political opinions, she has just tanked. And it is exhilarating. Somebody being from California and knowing how liberal she is and knowing how oblivious she is to the world stage and politics. It is alleviating that she got her bubble burst. Now, I do pray for her. I do pray for her soul. I pray for her life. I hope she has a moment of clarity and coming to faith, so to speak. But just politics, just being an observer of what's been going on, I gotta say, I've had I'm sorry, I don't want to keep going on with this. Just for me, it's almost like being a kid and reading Garfield comics at, being in elementary school and reading them and just saying the spontaneous punchlines and looking at how, anyway, I'll stop. I'm sorry. I'm going off and I'm having a good time in my own head just thinking about that. Now, what I want to kind of end on, I addressed the Israeli elections and I addressed the potential impeachment of President Trump and the Democrat primary field, and briefly, I've addressed the field prior, but I was mainly wanting to address Tulsi Gabbard and really quickly Kamala Harris. So I've addressed the main topics that I had on the docket for today, but I do want to really briefly address a couple minor things that I had on my mind. And that is the unseen support for the Republican Party and President Trump. And just a side note, for those of you who are listening, for those of you who are curious as to my stance on President Trump, I've given some hints, I've given some indication of where I stand, but I think I want to spend an entire ConservaCast, or at least a good portion of one, giving my thoughts on President Trump, the pros and cons, the agreements, disagreements, and just giving some clarity as to where I do stand officially, because I don't want to give the perception that I'm uber supportive of him, or that I'm a never Trumper, or I don't want to do a disservice to that, and I want to give a broader understanding of where I stand and why I believe what I believe. But anyway, the support for him and the Democrat Party as a whole is gaining a lot of traction with the Hispanic community. Now, I really disdain the identity politics and the terms that are classified for certain races and all of that identity politics. But because it's bigger than me, and my own personal opinion doesn't change the larger political world, The term Hispanic has a lot of loaded meaning to it, but I want to just read an article from Univision, of all places, Univision, Univision in Spanish terms, of all places. Now, I do want to stipulate, this is written by Ronna McDaniel, who is pretty biased because she is the president of the Republican National Committee. She has her own biases, and I believe her uncle is Mitt Romney, and she may not agree with everything of him. But anyway, this is still taken from the website Univision, which is a Spanish outlet, a news organization. And I'm just going to read an excerpt. This is taken from, let's see, September 13th, so pretty recent. And the title of the article is "The Hispanic Community Has Made Historic Gains During the Trump Administration." Now, I want to read just a little bit of a excerpt from that. Let's see. Here we go. While Democrat candidates remain oblivious and out of touch, Americans, especially in Texas, are taking note of the positive impact that President Trump and Republicans' pro-growth, pro-business policies are having on American families and businesses. RNC data shows President Trump's approval among Hispanic Americans in the state has increased by 20% since 2016. That means he has nearly 1 million new Hispanic supporters. This may surprise Democrats who have taken for granted Hispanic votes for far too long, but Hispanic Americans are responding to the results of this administration. Now, that was just one of the excerpts or paragraphs from that article. I am not surprised. As someone who would be classified or termed, quote unquote, Hispanic American, I'm pretty familiar with the broader community, even though I'm not fully entrenched. My wife is not Hispanic. Our children would be considered, quote unquote, half, however you want to term that. I really disdain identity politics, but I am not, Spanish is not my first language. I do not live in a neighborhood that is predominantly Hispanic or Mexican or Puerto Rican. But obviously I grew up in a family that was, and I did have classmates, and I am familiar. I do live in California, so that goes without saying, the demographics out here. My point is just that I am not surprised because many of you may already know the Hispanic or Mexican community in America is at its heart pretty conservative. There's a lot of pro-family values. There's a lot of the entrepreneurial spirit. There is a lot of patriotism of national security to enlist into the armed forces. Myself served 4 years on active duty in the U.S. Air Force as a security forces member, and so I became familiar with other people who had served and enlisted who were from Hispanic heritage. So at its heart, the larger community of Hispanics in America are pretty conservative or right-wing, and they may not even know it. That's another topic for discussion. I've touched on that in the past. But there are a lot of Hispanics who are not politically involved, who are pretty conservative, pretty right-wing. And it's no surprise that the RNC or Trump's administration has tried to tap into that demographic. If there is more education given to them and making them aware of the issues and where they may stand, and even those who are politically involved and think they're liberal or Democrat, if there's some re-education, so to speak, that's a pretty bad term, but if there's some outreach to them to show them how they really aren't liberal or Democrat or left-wing, and that at their heart, their cultural stances on things would be more conservative or right-wing. Again, family values, social issues, pro-life, patriotism, entrepreneurial spirit. If there is a concerted effort to reach them, it's no surprise that there has been some gains among the administration and the Republican Party to increase the number of the quote-unquote, again, Hispanic communities to support them. So I just briefly wanted to touch on that, and I won't get further into that perhaps in another ConservaCast, but that was an article that I found intriguing. And in fact, just another quick note, President Trump apparently got even more votes than candidate Romney in 2012 among the Hispanic community. So he already started off with quite an impressive number of supporters from 2016. Now, that actually flies in the face of this whole stigma that he's gained of being a racist or anti-Hispanic or or being a racist, etc. But it diminishes and insults those supporters who actually do follow and agree with his policies and identify as Hispanic. So for the hundreds of thousands or millions of Hispanics who actually do support him, it's pretty insulting to accuse him of being racist or anti-Hispanic. And again, I don't want to get too far into that. I'll probably address that a little bit more in a different ConservaCast. But the last thing I wanted to address is the unfortunate reality that politics is a sport, or at least it has the dynamic of a sport, or the dynamics rather of a sport. The reason I say that is that I hear a lot of people griping about how it's just getting on the team, or getting on the Republican team, or getting on the Democrat team, or getting on the liberal or conservative team, and the hatred for that type of concept, or just go along to get along with the bigger picture. And sometimes I actually do agree. I think it is very healthy. I encourage independent thought. I encourage people to not just go along to get along. But at the end of the day, once we have established our independent thought, we do want to build a team. We do want to agree to disagree on certain issues, and I've talked in length before about that, and get on a team. Now, the reason why I mention that is I just realized relatively recently why people have careers or have had careers as political commentators or newscasters who have a sports announcer background. And what I mean by that, I'll be very specific. I used to hate Keith Olbermann. Now, I should rephrase that. I used to hate his career on MSNBC. Now, as a kid, because he goes back to the 80s, I believe, as a youth, I used to see him on TV giving sports analysis. He was actually kind of funny, because he wasn't political. He was just talking about sports. He'd do some very quirky, comical things on his show. And then I started seeing him on MSNBC and started thinking, why is this sportscaster giving political commentary? Why have they hired somebody who should be talking about baseball and basketball and the World Series or the championships of certain things? Why is he out there as a political commentator? In fact, he actually was a moderator for one of the debates. I forget which one it was, but it was a presidential debate. He was taken so seriously that he was given the credentials, or I don't want to say this. He was allowed or tasked with being a moderator to guide the conversation of the potential leader of the free world. How does somebody who used to be a goofy sportscaster rise to that position? And so I started thinking about it. It makes a lot of sense. The thought processes and analysis that goes into giving commentary for baseball and football, and the very quick thinking of giving some type of opinion about those things and how the organization works, the history of them, certain specific players, and how they have to work on a team is very analogous to the political world. Whether it's pitting the Republican Party against the Democrat Party, or whether it's pitting the specific candidates of certain elections or races going together, there is a lot of crossover between analyzing sports and giving commentary and giving your opinion of what the outcome may be or what it should be even. There is a very large crossover to the political world. And then I started thinking, well, who else is similar to this? I also used to really not like the career of Brian Kilmeade on Fox News. I didn't like his style. I didn't like his approach to things. And come to find out, he also has a history and resume of being a sportscaster, or at least a sports analyst. So, kind of on different ends of the spectrum between Keith Olbermann and Brian Kilmeade, they would definitely not agree with each other. But it just really confused me. How do these people, Keith Olbermann and Brian Kilmeade, how do they have a career in anchoring or being a commentator for the news or politics if they're essentially just sportscasters? Now, one honorary mention that I want to put out there is Steve Deace. He is a opinion person for the Blaze TV, previously its own affiliate of Mark Levin's news media, Conservative Review, I believe it's called. They've merged, I think, with the Blaze. But I've been kind of following his career for a while, and I actually do like his career and agree with a lot of what he has to say. Not everything, obviously. Well, if two people agree on everything, well, then one of them is useless, as the saying goes. So we do have some differences of opinion, but for the most part, I do agree with him and like his career. But he also used to be a sportscaster, to loosely use that term. And so it started to dawn on me. The reason these people have the ability to be tasked with these positions is because there is a huge layover between sports analysis and commentary and political analysis and commentary. Now, some of you may cringe at that. Some of you may hate that concept of how too often people just agree with people that with whom they shouldn't agree, just to further the ball, just to get something done, just to do things. But unfortunately, that is the reality. And if you're actually a student of history and you actually do follow and have learned about the previous administrations and political campaigns, you will see that even the best of historical politicians understood this. They understood the concept of politicking, the idea of knowing how to get things done and get their objectives pushed forward by working with others who may not agree and who may have some things in common. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan. I mean, you can really look at some of the big names throughout history. And if you honestly take a look at what they did, they had to understand the concept of politicking, and that politics is a sport, or at least has a lot of the same dynamics as a sport. So those are my thoughts. I've given quite a bit of information. This is, I think, a little bit longer of a ConservaCast, but I hope you've found it interesting and entertaining. I've gotten a little bit out of this for your own edification, for your own ability to take with you and consider. And lastly, I do want to, once again, encourage you guys to send in your recipes. We are still working on that. I wanted to find a good way to present that and kind of include that in and mesh that in these future ConservaCasts. So I've got a number of good ones out there. Spicy. I love spicy. Although now that I'm getting a little bit older, that spice just does not sit as well as it used to. And to be honest, I used to and still do try to eat plain raw habanero chilies like they're candy. Yes, I know it's quite a shock, and it always disturbs my wife when she sees me eat them. She cringes, turns her head, and will typically say, without missing a beat, "I don't know how you do that, why you do that." Yeah, but that may not be for much longer. I'm sorry, I'm stuttering my words because the reality is I will be 40 this year. In a few months, I will be turning 40 before the end of this year. Before this year closes out, I will be 40. I am... For those of you older than that, you may say, "Oh, you're just a kid. You're just so young." And for those of you younger than that, you might have some empathy in knowing that I'm starting to hit that midlife crisis age at the ripe time of that midlife crisis age. But it's reinforced when I can no longer just pop habanero chilies like they're candy. And my system says, you might be getting a little old for this, as I am no longer able to process. Just thinking about it kind of makes me hurt and cringe. My GI tract, my gastrointestinal tract is kind of cringing up a little bit and squeezing up on me right now. But nonetheless, I do still enjoy some good spicy foods. I actually made one of my dishes for my wife for our dinner last night, which she loves, a little bit spicy. And so we're going to be getting those recipes up in the near future. Please send them to us at conservativescorner.com, conservativescorner.com. Just go to the contact page and shoot an email with the ingredients and the instructions of how to make your dish and recipe. Well, thanks again for your time, folks, and may God bless you. And may God bless America.
Thanks for joining us once again, and we hope you will invite your friends and family to join us in our efforts to champion conservatism for generations to come.